Serial killers rarely emerge out of nowhere. They form slowly, like invisible patterns that only experts can detect before it's too late. Meticulously planned rituals, specific intervals between crimes, and victim selection that follows an internal logic, often incomprehensible to the average observer. The true serial predator isn't motivated by material gain or a momentary impulse. He's driven by a compulsion, a deep psychological need that can only be satisfied through a specific ritual, repeated with almost mathematical precision. In 1980s Florida, amidst economic growth and rapid population growth, a pattern of this nature began to form, invisible to most except those who learned to read the signs of organized predatory behavior. Serial killers are, above all, creatures of habit. Their compulsions make them predictable to those who know how to observe. The thin film of sweat covering Detective Richard Conners's name-changed forehead glistened under the fluorescent lights of the evidence room. The summer of 1985 had been particularly unforgiving in Jacksonville, Florida, where the humid air seemed to amplify the weight of each unsolved case. His hands roamed the photographs laid out on the metal table, 4 disappearances in 9 months, all seemingly unconnected. Until then. Conners wasn't the kind of man who believed in coincidences. 22 years on the force had taught him that patterns exist, even where the naked eye can't see them. And now, amid stacks of reports yellowed with age and stained with coffee, something was beginning to form. A subtle silhouette. A barely discernible signature connecting disappearances that at first glance had nothing in common. Duval County, with its mix of tourist beaches, leafy suburbs, and isolated swamplands, seemed the perfect setting for what Conners suspected was the work of a single person. The victims, 2 women and 2 men, varied in age, appearance, and occupation. The only common element among them was that they had all disappeared on Sunday nights between 9 and 11 p.m., usually on their way home from visiting family. It was the mid-1980s, a time when Florida was experiencing a real estate boom that attracted people from all over the country. The transient population made it easy for someone to disappear without raising immediate alarms. Often, weeks would pass before a disappearance was noticed or considered suspicious by local authorities, more concerned with the growing wave of drug-related crimes plaguing the state. The first case was reported in October 1984. Maria Reeves, name changed, 34, an administrative assistant, was last seen leaving her sister's house after Sunday dinner. Her vehicle was found 2 days later, parked in a shopping center on the outskirts of the city, locked, clean, and with no signs of a struggle or forced entry. Initially, police assumed she had fled voluntarily until Maria's wallet and documents were found intact inside the vehicle. 3 months later, it was the turn of Thomas Garland, name changed, 42, an accountant for a construction company. The pattern repeated itself. Disappearance after a family visit on a Sunday night, vehicle found in a public parking lot, personal belongings untouched. The only difference was the location. This time the car was located in the parking lot of a Methodist church, about 15 kilometers from where Thomas had last been seen. The following cases, April Johnson, name changed, 28, a nurse, and Michael Weston, name changed, 37, a teacher, followed the same silent protocol. Clean disappearances, with no witnesses, no apparent evidence, and no bodies. The absence of physical evidence began to become, paradoxically, the only discernible pattern. It was during his review of April Johnson's case that Conners noticed something that had gone unnoticed in previous investigations, a detail casually mentioned by a witness who claimed to have seen a dark brown Ford LTD parked near where April's car was found. The vehicle didn't appear to belong to anyone in the neighborhood, and the witness only mentioned it because he found it curious that someone would park there in a closed commercial area on a Sunday night. Conners revisited the other cases. There was no mention of a brown Ford LTD in the official records, but upon re-interviewing family members and potential witnesses, he discovered that a neighbor of Thomas Garland had commented on a large, dark, older car, maybe a Ford, parked across the street the night of the disappearance. In the case of Maria Reeves, a co-worker mentioned seeing a similar car in the company parking lot days before her disappearance, with a man apparently waiting inside. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was beginning to materialize. The shadow of a pattern, of a presence that observed, studied, and selected its victims with meticulous precision. The connection between the cases lay not in the victims themselves, but in the methodology of those who chose them. Someone who knew their routines, who knew they would be alone at that particular time of the week. Someone driving a brown 1970s Ford LTD. With the vehicle theory as a link, Connors began mapping the locations where the brown Ford LTD had been sighted. A circular pattern emerged. The sightings created a perimeter around North Jacksonville, suggesting that whoever was responsible for the disappearances likely resided in that area. The theory gained further support when the detective discovered that the same vehicle had been spotted near an abandoned gas station in the weeks preceding each disappearance. While Connors' investigation progressed silently, the person responsible for the disappearances maintained his methodical routine. The people of Jacksonville went about their daily lives, unaware of the presence moving among them. Local newspaper headlines focused on economic expansion, political disputes, and drug trafficking cases. In an era before the internet and social media, missing persons cases rarely received sustained media attention, especially when the victims were adults without connections to influential people. At the Jacksonville Police Department, most investigators considered the cases unrelated, possibly willful escapes or isolated accidents. It was the early 1980s, a period when the concept of serial killer was just beginning to enter the popular vocabulary and formal investigative methodology of American law enforcement, particularly after the highly publicized cases of Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy in the late 1970s. The FBI had recently established its behavioral science unit, but its methodologies were still viewed with skepticism by many local police departments. Connors' decision to treat the disappearances as potentially connected did not immediately find support among his superiors. "You're seeing patterns where there aren't any, Richard," Captain Lawson, name changed, said during a departmental meeting in August 1985. "We have real cases to solve. People are being killed in the streets by drug dealers. We can't waste resources on theories based on a brown car someone might have seen." Ignoring his colleagues' skepticism, Connors devoted his free time to the investigation, creating a detailed map on his apartment wall with photos of the victims, the locations of their disappearances, and possible sightings of the Ford LTD. Something about the meticulousness of the cases deeply disturbed him. The lack of physical evidence suggested a level of planning and execution that surpassed that of the average criminal. It was during this period that the department received news of the disappearance of 31-year-old librarian Elaine Morris, name changed, after visiting her parents on a Sunday night. The pattern repeated itself, and this time Connors was prepared. Mobilizing a small group of officers who believed in his theory, they established surveillance in church parking lots, shopping malls, and isolated areas on the city's northern perimeter, where he suspected the vehicle would be abandoned. On Monday night, Connors' team located Elaine's car in a church parking lot, exactly as predicted. Rather than simply processing the scene as in previous cases, they set up a covert surveillance operation. Early Tuesday morning, at approximately 2:15 a.m., a brown 1974 Ford LTD slowly pulled into the parking lot. The driver, a middle-aged Caucasian man, carefully checked his surroundings before parking next to Elaine's vehicle. The team watched as the man got out of the car and walked around Elaine's vehicle, apparently checking for any signs of police activity. Satisfied with his inspection, he opened the Ford's trunk, revealing what appeared to be a body wrapped in a light-colored sheet. The moment of the approach was timed to be when the suspect was transferring the body from the trunk to the back seat of his vehicle, a change in his pattern that investigators didn't understand at the time. The man was identified as Gabriel Morton, 47, an employee at a local funeral home. Single, discreet, and with no criminal record, Morton lived alone in a modest home on the outskirts of Jacksonville, precisely within the perimeter Connors had theorized. His employment at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home since 1972 gave him access to knowledge of human anatomy and chemicals, as well as a perfect alibi for behavior that might seem suspicious in someone else, such as carrying large packages wrapped in sheets or being awake at unusual hours. A search of Morton's residence revealed a meticulously organized basement with soundproofed walls. There were no bodies at the scene, but police found personal belongings of the 5 missing victims, carefully catalogued and stored in handmade wooden boxes. Each box contained a personal item: a watch, a pair of glasses, a prayer book, a wedding ring, a brooch, along with a small piece of stained fabric. Subsequent analysis revealed that the fabrics contained blood consistent with that of the victims. The most disturbing thing about Morton's residence was a small makeshift altar, with Catholic religious symbols mixed with elements of Afro-Brazilian religions, indicating a peculiar syncretism. Diaries found on a bookshelf revealed that Morton believed he was purifying the souls of his victims through a ritual involving specific prayers during and after their deaths. In his notes, he described each victim as an impure vessel that needed to be emptied and filled with light. During the initial interrogations, Morton remained silent, with a serene expression that disconcerted even the most experienced investigators. On the third day of interrogation, he finally spoke, but only to inform that he would not discuss the cases without first praying for the souls of his transformations, his term for the victims. "You don't understand the importance of the ritual," he calmly told Detective Connors. "If I reveal their location without the proper prayer, their souls will never find their way. I need my prayer books. I need to complete the cycle." The subsequent investigation revealed the extent of Morton's planning. He selected his victims after observing them for weeks, studying their routines, especially family visits on Sundays. Using the funeral home uniform and a Ford LTD, a model commonly used as an informal hearse at the time, he would approach victims, posing as a driver sent by a family member concerned about weather conditions or an emergency. The professional approach and formal uniform reduced initial suspicion, allowing Morton to get close enough to use a handkerchief soaked in chloroform, a substance he had access to through his work. Once unconscious, the victims were transported to his basement, where the ritual began. Searches for the victims' bodies initially focused on cemeteries and funeral homes where Morton had worked. The theory was that he may have used legitimate burials to conceal his victims. However, extensive searches turned up nothing conclusive until investigators noticed a pattern in Morton's notes: repeated references to return to water and cycle of purification. The investigation shifted focus to swampy areas on the outskirts of Jacksonville, specifically to an isolated area near the Nassau County border. In September 1985, using sniffer dogs and specialized teams, investigators located what appeared to be a disposal site. However, contrary to expectations, they found not whole bodies, but rather parts carefully wrapped in white cloth, each package apparently subjected to a specific ritual before being deposited. Subsequent forensic analysis identified the remains of all 5 victims, as well as 3 other individuals whose disappearances had not previously been connected to the case. The discovery brought the total number of victims to 8, making Gabriel Morton one of Florida's most prolific serial killers to date. What set Morton apart from other similar criminals was the almost reverential care with which he treated his victims after their deaths. There were no signs of sexual violence or torture, unusual in serial murder cases of the time. The bodies bore only a single puncture mark at the base of the skull, suggesting that death was administered swiftly and, by Morton's distorted standards, mercifully. The diaries revealed that Morton believed he was performing a ritual of salvation. In his warped mind, he selected people he considered lost souls, individuals who, according to his distorted observations, showed signs of spiritual emptiness. The ritual involved reciting prayers while watching the life leave the victim's body, followed by an elaborate preparation process that included ritualistic cleansing, dismemberment, and wrapping in white cloths with religious symbols drawn on them. "Each vessel must be emptied completely to receive the light," he wrote in an entry dated January 1985. "The vehicle that carries them must be consecrated. The place of return must be blessed. Without these precautions, the cycle is broken and the soul remains trapped." The reference to the consecrated vehicle explained the behavior observed by the surveillance team. Morton was performing some kind of ritual in the Ford LTD before transporting Elaine Morris's remains. Further investigation revealed modifications to the vehicle, including religious inscriptions, discreetly engraved under the seats and in the trunk. The trial of Gabriel Morton began in April 1986, attracting national attention at a time when public fascination with serial killers was on the rise. The prosecution, led by Nathan Blackwood, name changed, built a meticulous case based on physical evidence, diaries, and the partial confessions Morton eventually offered after being allowed to offer his final prayers for each victim, a controversial compromise the prosecution accepted to obtain information about possible additional victims. Throughout the trial, Morton remained an enigmatic figure. Always well-dressed in dark suits, with perfectly combed grey hair, he looked more like a conservative civil servant than the perpetrator of heinous crimes. His clear blue eyes rarely betrayed emotion, except during the testimony of forensic pathologists describing the state in which the bodies were found. At these moments, witnesses in court reported seeing Morton move his lips silently, apparently reciting prayers. The defense attempted to build an insanity case, arguing that Morton's obvious disconnect from reality and his elaborate belief system indicated a mind incapable of comprehending the criminal nature of his actions. Forensic psychiatry experts testified about a possible diagnosis of schizophrenia with religious delusions, potentially triggered by an undocumented childhood trauma. However, the meticulousness of Morton's planning, his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy in his funeral home job for years, and his elaborate efforts to avoid detection contradicted the thesis of an individual completely disconnected from reality. His competence to judge the wrongfulness of his actions was established when prosecutors presented diary entries in which Morton detailed methods for avoiding leaving evidence and expressed concern about being discovered by police. "I must be more careful," he wrote after April Johnson disappeared in February 1985. "The newspapers are beginning to notice. The police will make connections eventually. A longer interval between transformations may be necessary. The work is important, but it must continue uninterrupted." After a 3-week trial and 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Gabriel Morton guilty of 8 counts of first-degree murder. In May 1986, he was sentenced to death in the electric chair, in accordance with Florida law at the time. The sentence was met with an unnerving silence from the condemned man, who merely nodded slightly, as if confirming a previously agreed-upon commitment. During the years that followed, as his appeals slowly wound their way through the judicial system, Morton granted a single interview to an FBI researcher studying the psychology of religiously motivated serial killers. This conversation, recorded in 1989, offered a rare glimpse into the twisted logic that motivated their crimes. "You ask if I regret it," I told the interviewer. "How can anyone regret fulfilling their calling? I was chosen for this work. The souls trapped in imperfect vessels needed to be released correctly. If I didn't perform the rituals, they would remain trapped between worlds." When asked how he selected his victims, Morton explained with disturbing clarity, "I watched them. I could see the emptiness in their eyes, the disconnection from the divine. Some people walk the world already dead inside. I simply formalized their condition and ensured that their souls would have a chance to be reborn purified." Particularly revealing was his explanation of the use of the brown Ford Ltd. "The vehicle is a vessel between worlds, brown like the earth we all return to. A Ford because my father drove one, a 74 because that was the year I received my calling. Everything has a meaning in the ritual. Nothing is accidental." Gabriel Morton was executed at Florida State Prison on November 17, 1992, becoming one of the few serial killers to receive the death penalty that decade. His final request was to be allowed to pray for his victims one last time, a request that was denied by prison authorities. Detective Richard Connors attended the execution as a witness. In an interview years later, he described how Morton, in his final moments, moved his lips in a silent prayer as the hood was placed over his head. Even at that moment, he was still performing some kind of ritual in his mind, Connors observed. It was as if the execution was just another step in his elaborate belief system. The Morton case transformed the way the Jacksonville Police Department approached seemingly unrelated disappearances. Connors' methodology of looking for subtle patterns and building behavioral profiles was gradually incorporated into investigative protocols, especially after the wider acceptance of criminal profiling techniques developed by the FBI in the late 1980s and early 1990s. For the victims' families, the closure of the case brought mixed relief. The discovery of the remains allowed for proper burial rites, but the nature of the crimes and the killer's disturbing motivations left lasting psychological scars. Support groups formed by family members during the trial remained active for years, eventually expanding their scope to assist families in similar situations throughout Florida. The dark brown Ford Ltd., a central element in Morton's personal mythology and a key tool in his crimes, was initially preserved as evidence. After all legal proceedings were completed, it was destroyed in a private ceremony requested by the victims' families. That car became a symbol of evil to us. Maria Reeves's sister, name changed, said in a statement, "We wanted it completely gone, just as it did to our loved ones." Morton's house remained vacant for years, becoming the subject of urban legends among local teenagers. Eventually, it was acquired by the county and demolished in 1997, making way for a small memorial honoring the victims, a discreet plaque bearing their names and the inscription, "To those whose journey was cut short, may they find the peace they were denied." The marshy area where the remains were discovered underwent environmental restoration in the early 1990s, part of a broader initiative to preserve Florida's ecosystems. Today, few visitors to what has become a nature reserve are aware of the macabre story that unfolded there years earlier. Nature reclaimed the space, covering the sites where Morton performed his macabre rituals with lush vegetation. The case of Gabriel Morton remains one of the most unique in American criminology of the 1980s, not only because of the nature of the crimes, but also because of the rare window it offered into the inner workings of a mind where religious fanaticism, delusion, and murderous methodology intertwined in a unique way. Subsequent studies of his psychopathology were incorporated into FBI training manuals, specifically regarding serial killers motivated by distorted religious beliefs. Morton's diaries, initially withheld as evidence, were eventually archived with access restricted to authorized researchers. His 12 notebooks, filled with meticulous handwriting, ritual diagrams, and distorted interpretations of sacred texts, provided valuable material for the study of the criminal mind, particularly the intersection between delusional disorders and organized homicidal behavior. For Detective Richard Connors, the case defined his career. After Morton's execution, he dedicated himself to specializing in serial crime investigations, developing methodologies to identify patterns in seemingly unrelated cases. Before his retirement in 1998, Connors had contributed to the resolution of 3 additional serial killer cases in the southeastern United States, always applying the patient and methodical approach that allowed him to see what other investigators had missed in the Morton case. Gabriel Morton's story exemplifies a disturbing truth about serial killers. They are often not obvious outsiders or marginalized figures, but individuals who have built seemingly conventional lives, hiding their homicidal compulsions behind facades of normalcy. Morton, with his steady job, conservative appearance, and polite manner, personified what experts would later call the organized killer, methodical, controlled, and capable of maintaining an impeccable public persona. In the community where he lived for more than 2 decades, the revelation of his crimes provoked the typical wave of shock and denial. Neighbors and co-workers expressed the usual disbelief. He was so quiet, so helpful. He always said hello when you passed by. You'd never imagine he'd be capable of something like that. The cliché of the serial killer as the guy next door found in Morton one of its most literal and disturbing expressions. The transformations in criminal investigation that followed the Morton case reflect a significant transition period in American justice. The 1980s marked the consolidation of more sophisticated forensic techniques, the development of criminal profiling as an investigative tool, and a growing understanding of the psychology of serial killers. The Morton case, occurring in the midst of this transformative decade, became a case study in how traditional investigative methods could be complemented by new analytical approaches. Particularly significant was the case's contribution to understanding how religious motivations can manifest in serial killers. Unlike cases where religion is used primarily as a method of controlling victims, Morton's belief system was entirely self-contained, a private universe of meanings and rituals that existed primarily to satisfy his own psychological needs. His victims were not converted or indoctrinated. They were simply incorporated as elements in his elaborate personal mythological system. In 1994, 2 years after Morton's execution, an academic study was published comparing his case to that of other serial killers motivated by religious delusions. The study highlighted how Morton's peculiar syncretism, mixing Catholic, Afro-Brazilian, and personal elements, reflected both his biography and the cultural environment of Florida, a state marked by religious diversity and Latin American and Caribbean influences. For Jacksonville residents who lived through that period, the case left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. "That's when we lost a certain innocence," a local journalist commented in a retrospective published a decade after the crimes. Before the Morton case, we still believed we knew our neighbors, that we could trust appearances. Afterward, there was always that doubt, that silent question about what might be going on behind closed doors. The case's cultural impact extended beyond Florida. In the early 1990s, as America's fascination with serial killers reached its cultural peak, the Morton case was indirectly referenced in films and television series. The figure of the methodical religious killer, with his conservative appearance and elaborate homicidal philosophy, became a recurring trope in American popular culture, a distant but recognizable echo of the real man who performed his deadly prayers in the Florida swamps. For Jacksonville's religious communities, the case presented a particular challenge. Local religious leaders actively worked to dissociate genuine faith from Morton's homicidal delusions, emphasizing that his belief system was a pathological distortion, not an authentic reflection of any established religious tradition. Several local churches held memorial services for the victims, seeking to reclaim the religious language and symbols that Morton had perverted. As the years passed and new forensic technologies developed, aspects of the Morton case were re-examined. In 2002, DNA analysis of preserved evidence confirmed the identities of the 8 known victims and ruled out connections to other unsolved cases in the region. Modern investigations have validated Conners's original conclusions. Morton had operated alone, following a specific pattern that began and ended within the established time frame. While Morton's execution formally closed the case in the judicial system, its reverberations continue to be felt in police practice and in the academic understanding of delusional killers. His case is regularly studied in police academies and criminology courses as an example of how subtle patterns can connect seemingly unrelated crimes and how the appearance of normality can mask a deeply disturbed mind. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Morton case is about the nature of close observation. It was Detective Conners's ability to notice what others overlooked, an occasionally mentioned brown Ford Ltd., a pattern of Sunday night disappearances, that eventually broke Gabriel Morton's deadly cycle. In an increasingly fast-paced and distracted world, the case remains a disturbing reminder that sometimes the most meaningful patterns are those that exist at the margins of perception, visible only to those who have learned to truly observe. This narrative is based on archives and historical accounts. Some names have been changed. We seek to understand, not sensationalize. The outcome matches public conviction records. No graphic violence was described.